Now, if we take Alexander's observations of how society's morality fluctuates over time and place it next to God's unchanging and eternal moral law on the graph, it would look something like this. God's eternal law is perfect, solid, and constant. Meanwhile, the moral condition of our hearts is fluctuating over time and is being reflected in our social condition. At some points in history, when societies have found faith, there has been an upward curve that has brought general morality closer to God's standard. In those moments when the two have been closest, those societies have prospered and have found courage, liberty, and abundance. At other points, when they have turned away from God, societies have gone into decay. Now, it's important to realize that Christians are told not to follow the pattern of the world, but to hold tightly to God instead. In Romans 12:2 it says, "Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think." So in theory, the morality of the Christian should look like this on the graph. We shouldn't adapt to the ideas of the age, but simply keep our eyes on God as our fixed reference point. As you can see from our graph, this means that over the years, the gap between what we believe and what the world believes varies over time. Sometimes it's close and other times it's far apart. That means it has been easier to be a Christian in this world at some times than at other times. When we have been blessed with revivals of faith, the general moral climate of society has surged upwards and the difference between us and the world hasn't been that large. On the other hand, there have been times when the morality has fallen away and Christians have inevitably started to become isolated and persecuted. It's not us that fluctuates throughout the years, and it certainly isn't God, it's the world. You see, the world makes the mistake of thinking that all change represents progress. It doesn't see that godless change is in fact entropy, like mouldy apples who can't see their own mouldiness. On the other hand, the Bible and its moral precepts have been the same for thousands of years and will never change. Now, unfortunately, we are living in a moment in history when the morality of the world is falling away from God, and because of the increasing gap, Christians are increasingly marginalized and despised. If the gap keeps increasing, things will get much worse still for Christians. But before we Christians start feeling sorry for ourselves as we anticipate the dark times ahead, it should be emphasized that the church not only has the power, but it has the responsibility to change society for the better. Jesus told us that we are the salt of the earth. Now, salt is a preservative, so what he meant was that we are called to stop society from going mouldy or bad. Where the truth is being attacked, it is our job to defend it. Jesus also told us that we are the light of the world. Now, this is something more proactive. It means being intentional in bringing the gospel to the world and letting our good deeds shine so that people come to know Jesus through us. Jesus promised that if we did this, the gates of hell could not and would not prevail against us. So here's something we need to get a hold of. The truth is that if society is failing, it's because the church first began failing. It's because we stopped being salt and light. It's because we became complacent, comfortable, apathetic, selfish, or fearful. As goes the church, so goes the world is a reliable saying. If the church goes into decline, it won't be long before the world follows. We are its moral guardians. That's why in 1 Peter 4:17 it says that judgment begins with God's household. If the church takes the command to be salt and light seriously, we will change the moral climate of society and save souls. That's a simple fact. Without any shadow of a doubt, history tells us that whenever men and women have taken the Great Commission seriously and in His strength boldly proclaimed the gospel, it has always changed things for the better. I get the feeling that Christians think of themselves as powerless in the face of rampant secularism and occult spirituality today. We don't think we can really change things, but that's a lie from the mind of Satan that has no grounding in reality. When you read the book of Acts in the Bible, you are left with the unavoidable conclusion that the Spirit-filled Christians in those days were an unstoppable force in the world. Men and women of God were filled with courage to boldly proclaim the gospel by the power of the Holy Spirit, and the gates of hell just couldn't prevail against it. The truth was spreading like wildfire, and beatings and torture and even deaths just couldn't derail them. Ever since those days, whenever Christians have chosen to fulfill the Great Commission, they have revolutionized the world and raised social morality in the process. History attests this fact. Whenever the Great Commission has been taken seriously, it has always changed the world. And that Great Commission still applies to us. We are all called to be Wilberforces and Luther King Jr.'s and William Tyndales and Apostle Paul's in our own time, to let our faith embolden us, to challenge the prevailing norms of our age, endure the scorn, and to change things for the better, to not conform to the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, and then to let that inner transformation impact the world around us. That is what it means to be salt and light. And if we take the command seriously, there is simply nothing on earth that can stop it. Nothing. The only thing that can get in the way is our own apathy and fear and faithlessness. If we refuse to be salty or luminous, society will continue to fail as moral entropy brings chaos. Frederick D. Huntington once said, "It is not scientific doubt, not atheism, not pantheism, not agnosticism that in our day and in this land is likely to quench the light of the gospel. It is a proud, sensuous, selfish, luxurious, church-going, hollow-hearted prosperity." We have to ask ourselves if that describes us. The Great Tribulation won't come about in the end because the dark was more powerful than the light. It will come about because the church stopped being the light, and as the light retreated, the darkness could advance. Jesus said that when he returns, there will be very few left with faith. The Bible also talks of a falling away or a great apostasy towards the end of time. What I'm trying to do here is to avoid the default Christian response to the failing world, which at this present time seems to be one of abject passivity. If politics is failing, then let's stop voting. If church is not getting things right, then let's stop going. Wherever there are signs of decay, let's just retreat to somewhere that isn't yet affected. We're too busy looking for comfort and safety instead of going out to meet the challenges of the enemy. But if Christians become passive and withdraw, then everything that is going wrong with the world will just perpetuate itself and the rate of deterioration will increase. We are the resistance to Satan's schemes. I think pre-tribulation rapture theology might have a part to play in this mindset. This is the idea that although the world is deteriorating, Christians will be pulled out of the world or raptured into heaven before the Great Tribulation and the Antichrist rise to global prominence, and will therefore all be saved from the really bad times ahead. I think it might have created an attitude in us where we think our job is merely to hunker down and wait for Jesus to come back and just hope that he does so before we're personally affected by the decay. Have you ever seen news reports or movies where law and order has broken down in some African nation and Western civilians have retreated to their national embassy for safety? Outside the compound gates there is chaos and violence, and the locals are threatening to break into the safe zone. Meanwhile, there are helicopters flying in to airlift the foreigners to safety. Everyone inside the embassy compound is just watching the lawlessness outside with horror and praying that a helicopter gets back to pull them out before the gates give way completely. Well, I think that's a picture of the church in many ways. We see the increasing lawlessness out there. We see chaos growing. We see the noose tightening around us, that freedoms are evaporating, that poverty is increasing and society is crumbling, and we're just looking on in horror and waiting for Jesus to come back and chopper us out of here before our compound gates are broken down completely. There's a sense in which we're ready to abandon the world to its fate because we're going home and that's all that matters. In fact, there may be a sense in which we hope the world decays more quickly because that might speed Christ's return. With this mindset, the only ones with the real answers to the ills of society, the only ones with the message that can save souls and change lives, are guilty of standing idly by while the world caves in. I don't think it's a bad thing for us to wait expectantly for Jesus' return, and I don't think it's wrong to hope that it happens speedily. And yes, the tribulation of the end must come. But when he comes back, I would hope he would find at least some of us working for his kingdom like he commanded, rather than cowering behind the four walls of our church building. He gave us a command to go and a spirit against which nothing can prevail, and when he returns he finds us hiding. I think whichever generation is responsible for the capitulation of the church before the Great Tribulation is going to have a lot to answer for before God. The response from Christians to a failing world should never be to become more passive. It should be to become more active. It's to fight harder for faith, truth, and justice in his strength. For God has not given you a spirit of fear and timidity, but one of power, love, and self-discipline. The Spirit who lives in you is greater than the Spirit who lives in the world. Activism changes things, passivism does not. Pray longer, speak louder, work harder, stand taller, fight harder. It's selfish not to. Yes, even endure the persecution and the ridicule for his name's sake. Leave the safety of the compound and get out into the world to make a difference. This is how all genuine progress in the history of civilization has ever been made. All our best men and women experienced opposition and persecution. It's part of the deal. All the apostles except one died for their faith. Many of those who tried to get the Bible translated into English were burned at the stake by the Catholic Church. The war won't be won without its casualties, but it's better to die for the cause of the kingdom than to live a life of apathy and fear. Jesus said, "If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it, but if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it." Edmund Burke wrote, "All that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." Albert Einstein wrote, "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it." A photographer by the name of Thomas Hopker took this photograph on September 11th, 2001. Now this always reminds me of the church every time I see it. New York City has just been the recipient of the worst terrorist attack in American history. Black smoke billows from the World Trade Center and the Twin Towers are on the verge of collapse. People are dying over there. Meanwhile, a group of young adults are at a safe distance from the turmoil, where they are sunbathing, chatting and riding bikes, showing a callous and depraved indifference to the tragedy that is unfolding around them. Now likewise with the church, we know there is a tragedy unfolding in the world around us, but we choose to become passive and almost indifferent towards it. We choose to retreat from the danger to somewhere safe, where we can continue with our churchianity, our religiosity, our coffee mornings, bake sales, our building fundraisers, and our comfortable apathy. If the trouble ever threatens to encroach upon us, we simply move somewhere else where it won't, all the while praying for Jesus to come quickly and save us before we experience discomfort. But this isn't our calling. If anything, our calling is to be like the firefighters were that day. While everyone was running away from the danger, they were the only ones who ran towards the danger, against the tide, aiming to save as many people as possible and even willing to give up their own lives in the process. That should be Christians. Charles Spurgeon said, "God save us from living in comfort while sinners are sinking in hell." He exhorted us saying, "Brethren, do something, do something, do something. While societies and unions make constitutions, let us win souls. I pray you be men of action, all of you. Get to work and quit yourselves like men." C.S. Lewis described the whole thing as well as anyone when he said, "Enemy-occupied territory, that is what the world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say landed in the skies, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage." Are we fighting that campaign of sabotage, or are we simply cowering behind four walls in hope that Jesus comes back to sweep us away before we're directly affected by the moral decay? I believe that would be a forlorn hope. I don't think the church will escape the Great Tribulation, and at any rate, it would be an embarrassment to our calling.